This is the Strike Mash Boil podcast, presented by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club. This week, we go through a list of our favorite homebrew books and judge a Kölsch. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Strike Mash Boil. If you haven't noticed, I'm not Marco. This is Phil. That's because while I was editing the show this week, I realized we never recorded the intro portion of the show. Yeah. Anyway, this week Nick and Tim are back, and we're going to run through a list of our favorite homebrew books and why. We also are going to judge a Kölsch, so let's jump right into it, and here's Marco.
We've each picked three of our favorite homebrewing beer books, and we're going to go around and talk to you guys about why they're our favorites, give you just a brief understanding of what the books are about. So we're going to do this basically in our order of top three recommendations are, and we all hopefully have three different books, so that we're not falling all over each other for this one.
Yeah, I hope so. All right, up number 3, Nick. What's your number 3 pick?
Yes, my third pick for a book is called Water. This is part of the Brewing Element series. I think there's a malt, there's a yeast, and I don't know if there's am I missing one? There's a hops one, right? I believe there is. Okay. So the water one is one of the newer ones, I believe. So it's by John Palmer, Colin Kaminsky. It's a really great comprehensive guide for water profile and understanding brewing water. The one big caveat is it is literally a scientific textbook. So if you think you're going to go in and just casually read this while watching the Celtics play, it ain't going to happen. This is stuff that you really got to take the time to read. Now, I don't want to scare people away due to that, because there is some basic information about water profile and stuff. But, for example, I turned to a random page and there's a chart that says charge per millimole of carbonate species. So, you're getting into some deep shit here. It is very interesting if you like it, if you're into equations and understanding pH and alkalinity, residual alkalinity, and different kind of water profiles. But just know that going in that this can be a hard book to understand, but I still highly recommend it, especially if you want to take your brewing to the next level. Water is sort of the last frontier as far as making great beer goes. It's sort of the last kind of part where you put your head into to understand how to make the best beers as possible, and this is a great book to kind of reference.
All right, number 3 pick, Tim.
So number 3 for me is actually a relatively new book for me, honestly, even though but I decided to put it into the mix anyhow. It's also out of the Brewing Elements series that Nick just described, and it's called For the Love of Hops: A Practical Guide to Aroma, Bitterness, and the Culture of Hops, and kind of fits in with my key brewing ingredient, one of my favorite ingredients. So I'd like to understand hops better, and that was my my primary really interest in this book to begin with. But not only did it describe all of the major hops that you can buy out there in quite a bit of detail, but it goes into just in general things like hops and aroma, the history of hops, how to grow hops, harvesting hops, which I have. I grow some hops at home. I know both Marco and Phil grow hops as well. So just tips on. I've been growing them. I've yet to successfully sort of harvest and use them at this point. So that's a goal for this year. Things like dry hopping and stuff. So I find them fascinating, and there's just such a wide variety of them, and they continue to evolve. So that's. I think it's a great book that covers a lot of that.
Number 3, me. All right. My number 3 pick is Session Beers, Brewing for Flavor and Balance by Jennifer Talley. Really, it's about the history of session beers. So runs you through not only the history in England, but also in Belgium and Germany and Central Europe. England's not the only place that low-gravity beers are extremely popular. I started brewing the big boozy beers. I probably went a year brewing nothing under 9% alcohol, and I've reached a point in my brewing and drinking life where I I want to be able to drink more than one beer in a sitting. And session beers, we can get through several. And I think we've talked about this on the bitters episode, where you can just drink several, low gravity English beers over and over. So one of the big keys of this book is that in session beers, they're so low gravity, you don't have a lot to hide behind. So you really need to nail your process. It's a complicated thing just to do something super basic between water prep, mashing, boiling, nailing your bitterness and that malt profile, and then your fermentation. Because some of these are so low gravity, there's not a lot to hide behind. Any off flavors in your fermentation are going to poke through. Talks through some of the modern versions, session style pale ales and IPAs, which are a favorite of mine. Places like Notch do that stuff fantastically. And then just a bunch of great recipes, lagers and blondes and pale ales and bitters and milds and lawnmower beer and all that sort of thing. So that is my number 3. All right, Marco, number 3.
Phil, real quick, have you tried any of those recipes yet? Do you have any that you recommend?
I have brewed a couple of these. I'm trying to remember which one I have brewed.
Did it come out okay? I mean, I guess I'm more curious about that.
I do remember it being good, yes.
Okay.
See which one. You know what it was? It was the lawnmower beer. I based my lawnmower beer recipe on this one.
Oh, actually, that was a really good beer.
That light American lager, yeah.
Yeah, so number 3 for me is Wild Brews, Beer Beyond the Influence of Brewer's Yeast by Jeff Sparrow. And basically what this book does is it really dives into traditional Belgian mixed culture beers. And it really goes into, the organisms that you're using to create complex beers other than sack strains of yeast. And they focus primarily on lambics, Flanders Red, and Flanders Brown in the book. But what's interesting about it is they also talk a little bit about some of the American beers that kind of fit in this kind of the lambics and plambics and those types of beers. But what they really dive into is process, how you're going to maximize your brew days so that you're feeding those cultures, because these beers take a really long time to produce, and you've got to be able to feed these beers over a significant period of time. And it really also dives into proper vessels to ferment them in, secondary vessels, barrel aging, the fruit additions, and also goes into blending them. Now, you guys have heard me talk on this podcast a bunch of times. You know how much I love Belgian beer, and you'll also know how much I love sour beer. These are the real sour beers, the ones that take a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to pull together, and process is really important when you're working on them. So this book does a really great job of explaining some of the Belgian culture that these beers are derived from, but also really holds your hand if you want to dive into these long process wild cultures for beers. Really cool book. Not as dry of a read as that water book that Nick was talking about earlier. It's also not going to really knock your socks off either, but it is really interesting. And if you're really into beer and you're into tradition, this book does that for you.
Hey Marco, have you read the American Sour Beer from Mike Tonsmere?
I haven't.
Could you compare the two?
It's interesting. They are really similar, but you can see the American influence because that is about American sour. So you can see how there's a slight deviation in how the trends and they modernize some of the processes. And I think that's one of the books that you're going to talk about. So I'll let you get into that a little bit more. But yeah, you can see a stark difference in the styles.
All right, let's take a quick break from the books and do a beer review. Each week, we review a beer submitted to us by a member of the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club or from one of our listeners. Our guest judge is going to walk through the judging process as if this were a homebrew competition, and all they know is the category of the beer, which this week is 5B Kölsch.
Oh, yeah, I had to move my books out of the way while I was pouring this beer for myself. Nick, I'm excited. Kölsch is one of those styles that I really like, so I can't wait to hear the doc's perspective on Kölsch and kind of cleaning this up for us and telling us what it's about and what we can expect. This one looks pretty good out of the gate, so I can't wait to hear what you think about it.
Yeah, Kölsch is a really great style. I really enjoy it. It's a great style for beginners who want to create sort of a lager type beer, but aren't able to lager beers. It sort of exists as a hybrid beer in that sense. So Kölsch exists under the category 5, pale bitter European beer, BJCP. It's category 5B. So a Kölsch is basically a clean, crisp, fairly balanced beer, usually with like a little subtle fruit and hop character. And it's characterized in Germany as sort of a top fermented lager. So what I mean by that, it's an ale, but it's generally fermented at lower temperatures, and then it'll usually be lagered afterwards as well to kind of get that crispness and that high attenuation that's characteristic of this style. So I guess we can just go right into it. I guess maybe a little bit about history. So Kölsch is traditionally it's the beer of Cologne, Germany, and it's a appellation. I think that's called. So it's similar to like Champagne, where Champagne has to be made in the Champagne region. Kölsch has to be made in Cologne with a certain amount of breweries there, and it sort of acts as sort of the rival to the sister city Dusseldorf, which of course has the alt beers. So those two cities kind of go at it in that sense. As I mentioned, this is a really great beer to brew if you're not able to lager. You want sort of that crisp, pale beer to drink, especially in the summer. It's a great beer. I think of it as sort of a spring beer, so this is actually a perfect time to be drinking this. Taking a look at it, color-wise, so one of the challenges with a Kölsch that many people will find when they brew this is clarity. So the Kölsch yeast is notoriously low flocculation. So in other words, it'll stay in solution for a long time. Even after you lager for a long time, it's a very dusty yeast, so it's almost always in solution. So it's very hard to get crystal clear. But this beer looks pretty good. It's not crystal clear, but according to BJCP, that's good enough, to be quite honest. That looks pretty clear. So I'm pretty happy about that, actually.
Yeah, although I will say that my head disappeared on this almost immediately.
Mine did too. Yep. And so when I first opened this, I opened this a little while ago to kind of let it warm up a little bit because it was very cold. I had a little smell of it, a little taste of it, and there was nothing going on there. It was very super clean, crisp, but not a whole lot of flavor. So I've let it warm up a little bit, and it's gotten a lot better, I think. So on the nose itself, it's slightly fruity. It's very clean, a little bit of a malt nose, but for the most part, it's a very clean aroma, which is typical of this style. It's sort of what you want. You can have a little bit of that fruitiness that comes from the yeast itself. And also the fermentation temperatures will produce some of those fruity characteristics. Something that's also typical of this style, it'll sometimes have like maybe a little bit of sulfur or a little bit of a mineralness or like a winey note. That's also pretty typical of that yeast. But overall, pretty clean, kind of what I expect from a Kölsch. So the taste itself, I get sort of a very light malt character. It's very clean on the palate, light tasting, pretty low hop bitterness. I don't really get much hop flavor. There is a fruitiness there, especially in the finish, and I kind of get that winey fruitiness, especially in the finish there, but not a whole lot of malt flavor. It's very clean. Right away, I questioned whether or not they use Pilsner malt in this beer because I don't get a lot of that Pilsner malt character. It's very clean, almost tastes like either it's two-row or maybe there's some wheat in there that's sort of masking those delicate notes of the Pilsner malt. So it's clean. I think it's well attenuated, which is what you want for the style. It has a little bit of that fruitiness from the yeast itself. But other than that, it's there's not a whole lot going on. There's not like a whole lot of character, which is a little bit surprising for me.
Yeah, I don't know if it's me. I get a bit of like a hay character, almost like I don't know. It's like it finishes kind of drier than I expected, but it has a bit of this sort of like sawdust hay thing for me that I just don't know that I've experienced before.
Yeah, when I drank it cold, it literally to me it tastes like a saison because it was quite dry, especially in the finish, and it had a little bit of that fruitiness you get like in the French saison yeast.
Yeah, I get a fruity and like I pucker just slightly. Just right after a sip too, so a little bit little bit of puckeriness, but
well, like a tartness, you're getting like a tartness out of it?
Just slightly. I get a little pucker. I'm not sure tart necessarily, but a little bit of pucker at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think that dryness can kind of create that. There might be some tannins there that may be what you're picking up as well. But yeah, it's quite dry. I mean, this style should be well attenuated, but not to the point of like a saison. And I think it's sort of getting to that point. You still kind of want to have that malt fullness, that malt, that body, I guess, that you kind of get from a Pilsner malt. So let's transition right to the mouthfeel. So for this style, you want it to be well attenuated, fairly crisp like a lager. And I think it's kind of there. I don't know about the crispness, but I think it's really well attenuated. I think it's a touch thin on the palate. I expected a little bit more body personally. Overall, I think it's a pretty good example of style. I just my one complaint is I think it's a little one-noted. I think it's sort of missing some of those delicate subtleties that come from a really well-brewed Kölsch. That can be, fermentation, that can be ingredients that are used. There's a whole host of things that can go into it. It makes it really difficult to kind of address how to improve the beer itself.
Yeah, it sounds like you're kind of thinking, again, this is without knowing it all, so it's a complete guess, but you're thinking that maybe it has something to do with not using Pilsner malt. There's probably a bit of a hop imbalance here too, right? So you mentioned that a little bit. So it's probably revisiting either the types of hops they used or the amount, or at which point during the boil, kind of revisiting that, looking at the malt bill a little bit. And then what's the typical yeast, people should be using for Kölsches?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple strains out there, but there's one typical that's always used, and it's the same strain they use when you make an alt beer as well. I don't remember which one it is for any of those.
But aren't they those the hybrid yeasts? Am I making that up?
They're considered hybrid yeasts because they can ferment very, very cold. I don't know how far down off the top of my head, but for this style, you want to ferment cold. That's the idea. So you want that balance of that crispness with a little bit of that fruitiness that comes from the ale yeast.
So not lager cold.
Well, I know White Yeast has a
2565.
2565. Yeah, I was going to say for.
And then White Labs is 29029.
They also have a Kölsch 2 yeast too. White Labs.
Yeah. I know there's a second one's available.
No, that's Omega.
So I mean, getting to your point, Marco, one of the things that they try and tell you not to do as a beer judge is to make assumptions. It can be really dangerous, because if you make the assumption that there's no Pilsner malt and you write that on the score sheet, and the submitter did use Pilsner malt, they're going to be like, what the fuck? This judge doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm never submitting again. So I'm saying this aloud, but I would never put that on a score sheet, because again, you really don't want to make presumptions. What you want to try and do is put in feedback that will help them to, maybe add some more complexity, think about your recipe design, try different malt, however you wanted to address it.
You're going to lead the witness, but you're not going to come right out and say it. You're going to tell them revisit your malt bill, increase the amount of Pilsner malt. Like, you'll say something like that versus saying, I don't think there's Pilsner in here.
Exactly. And that fruity character might be coming from the hops too. Maybe that's I didn't think I was getting hop flavor, but maybe that fruitiness is coming from the hops that they use. It's pretty hard to tell because it's not super overpowering.
Definitely fruitiness there though, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say though, this is one of those circumstances where you're nitpicking to the style. This beer is crushable. I could drink a lot of this beer. Like, this is a pretty decent beer that I would enjoy on a warm day or spring day. It would be really easily drank in my house. So it's just a matter of, this is when you're entering things into a particular style in BJCP, you are going to be judged directly against what those words say in the guidelines.
Right, that's the difference, right, between just a beer you're brewing to have on tap and something fantastic, and maybe it's even a mistake, but still fantastic. It's something you're entering into a competition where you need to pay attention to those things.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm being nitpicky according to not only the guidelines, but to the commercial examples that are given, that are sort of the gold standards, as well as my experience with other Kölsches I've drank. I've had some really good Kölsches from a couple members in this club, actually, and this one I think it's well brewed. I don't really get any major faults in it. I just think it's missing some of the subtle elements that make a Kölsch a Kölsch.
Yeah, which is easy enough to take that feedback, but then for us, I'm actually not one of them. I very seldom brew the same beer more than once. But for folks that are trying to master a style, one of the best ways to do it is to enter into competitions, but also to each time you brew it and you're pouring in a glass, is to break out those guidelines and read them as you're drinking the beer. It's a great way to say, am I picking up on that? And then doing a little bit of research to say, all right, if I didn't get some of those characteristics that I was looking for, what are the ingredients? What are the amounts that I need to play around with to get there? But it's a great way to be able to improve a particular style if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so overall, I think I would give this beer probably a 35, which is, I think, that's a really good score, depending on the category that could actually place. So I think it's a really well brewed beer, but not quite to the excellent part.
A few years ago, that would have been first place at the table at our competition. That'd be all right. I think a 28 was gold on that table that year.
I mean, it might still be. I think it's very nice, honestly, and the clarity. Seriously, for a homebrewed beer, I'm not sure you could get it too much clearer than that. That's a very well done from that standpoint. Somebody put some attention into that. And I agree with Marco from a crushability standpoint, but I'm not BJCP certified, so I'm just going by what I'm reading and comparing it. And for me, it falls into hits a lot of those notes that I see online.
Yeah, the clarity is really good. The one thing that also pops in my head when you said that is I wonder how old this beer is. Because now that I just taste it, this beer really shines when it's young, and it really falls off very quickly, similar to like a German Hefeweizen. So I wonder how old it is actually now that I kind of taste it and I sort of get those fruity aromas that come in, especially if the beer gets oxidized.
How does it change, Nick, as it ages? How is it different young?
Yeah, so it becomes oxidized. You lose a lot of those fresh flavors. So the malt kind of becomes a whole lot of nothing. You get some fruitiness from sort of the oxidation, and it just sort of tastes a little stale almost.
I see.
So that's typically what happens. And honestly, I'm getting a little bit out of this, but again, I don't want to make presumptions. I don't know what's going on in this beer, and I'm also being very nitpicky about it, trying to figure out, because whenever I taste a beer like this, and I know it's well brewed and it's what it should be, it's just missing that element. I just rack in my head, what would I do? What would I do to try and improve this, to go back to the table and figure out to make it better? And so that's the challenge, I think.
So if you were going to brew this beer for a competition, you've got to keep that young aspect of it in mind, which is tough for a competition, especially if it's AHA kind of competition and stuff. You might have to brew it a couple times, even possibly, to keep it fresh and keep it stellar.
Yeah, and HC is a good example of, you'll have months in between rounds. For beers like this, IPAs are another example where it changes so much in such a short period of time that you're likely rebrewing it. If you make it past round one and you're going into the final round, you're likely rebrewing it again.
Are they doing it that way this year? I didn't think NHC was doing I thought you were submitting all your beers up front this time.
I full disclosure, not entered into NHC this year, did not enter, so I have no idea, haven't really been paying attention to it.
Wait, what was the question?
Did NHC change it up so that you submit all of your beers at once this year, or are they still doing the break in between round one and round two?
I actually signed up for beers. I actually don't know. I think they're asking for 4 beers, so I'm assuming they're not making you ship twice. So, yeah.
So they must be doing it all at once this time around.
Yeah, that's the idea.
But I thought the first round judging and second round judging were a lot closer together this year than they have been historically.
Well, they're doing it all really close together.
Is it all on a weekend or within a couple weeks?
Yeah, it's in the same location. So
yeah.
Yeah, they've gotten pretty unique with that one. Anyway, the other thing, Nick, not Nick, but Tim, the other thing is not to sell yourself short on with your opinion when you're saying I'm not a BJCP judge. When you enter some of these more regional competitions, it's always good to remember that chances are you have a BJCP be certified judge at the table, but you also have somebody who's not certified that is playing as that second judge.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's always
almost always in the smaller competitions.
Huh, yeah, I see.
So ours is a prime example of that, where when we run our comp, we always have at least one certified judge at each table. But finding 25 certified judges can be challenging, so we filter in a non-certified judge at the same time. So that opinion is valuable. People that have aspirations to become BJCP certified do still get, I think Nick, they still earn points towards BJCP even if they're not certified. So they still have the ability to earn points towards their certification and increasing their rank. But chances are you have at least one judge there that you're getting score sheets for that's not certified. Which is why we're doing it this way, because this replicates the actual conversation that happens at a table. Yeah.
Right. Cool.
All right, fellas. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time. We have pretty decent Kölsch. We know that there's got some things that they've got to work on, but a 35 is a pretty nice score, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of this glass for sure. So I appreciate you guys taking the time and look forward to doing this again.
Somebody knows what they're doing. That was really good.
Yeah, all right. Now let's get back to some books.
All right.
If you like what you've been hearing on our show, hit that subscribe or follow button on your podcast service. And if you have any ideas or feedback for us, leave us a review or shoot us a DM on Instagram at StrikeMashBoil. Or join the conversation in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/MVHBC. All right, getting back to the books. Nick, what's your number 2 pick?
I'm going to talk about Radical Brewing.
Okay.
So this is actually by Randy Mosher, and this is a really, really interesting book. So as the name states, he talks a lot about beers that are sort of outside of the box. So we're talking about braggots, gruits, different types of meads.
So not pastry stouts and milkshake IPAs and all that.
No, so those are in. And also, this was way before that. I don't remember when this was written. Probably mid 2000s, maybe a little bit later, 2010, 2004. So okay. Yes, it's an older book. It's before all those styles, but it's really interesting because he really has some really off the wall ideas for different types of brews. I mean, there are some traditional recipes in here, but a lot of these recipes are very strange, very interesting. There's this one I wanted to brew forever. I just haven't gone around to. It's a Chanterelle Ale. So it's basically a beer made with chanterelle mushrooms and with a Belgian yeast to it. It looks really interesting. I did try and make one of these recipes in this book before is a brown ale with just amber malt, brown malt, and 2-row, and it was one of the worst beers I've ever brewed. I don't know what happened.
That happens.
I might have got the wrong ingredients.
It's a good endorsement, Nick, so far for the book. Right?
Exactly right. But the main reason why I like this book is it's really beautiful. So what I mean by the layout is really nice. There are pictures of a different beer paraphernalia and signs and old school beer images, bottles and stuff. It's a great book to just sort of read through and look at and get some ideas, kind of think outside the box. I'm the type of brewer that does very traditional, boring styles, and this one really kind of excites me to read it, even though I may not try some of these recipes. One last thing I'll highlight: there's a 12 beers of Christmas in here. Each one is for a different day, and there's different ingredients and different themes to it. So that kind of gives you an idea about what this book is sort of doing, and it's really interesting. So I recommend it. Radical Brewing by Randy Mosher.
All right, number 2, Tim.
All right, so my brewing kind of parallels another aspect of my life, another passion, which is cooking. So I consider myself a fairly avid and interested home cook, but I'm not super creative, quite frankly. I can execute, give a recipe, and I've got, I understand how to do things, techniques, and process and stuff. But so I'm very recipe based, and as I kind of upped my game in the all grain brewing world, I wanted to I was looking for a book that just had a whole bunch of recipes, basically. And so I'm looking at from Brew Your Own magazine. They have it's a book called Big Book of Clone Recipes, which is what it is. There are about 300 homebrew recipes in here. And what's super cool about this book versus even going online and other things is they're since they're all clones, they're all commercial beers that you can buy, so you know what they taste like to begin with, but the recipes are either submitted directly from the breweries or themselves or done in collaboration with all the breweries. So for, no matter what beer it is in here, you're getting sort of the brewery's take on how to do this on a homebrew level. So for me, it was like a gold mine, and I've made a shit ton of beers out of this book so far. I've done like a Treehouse Julius, Trillium Sleeper Street, Big Sky Moose Drool, Mikkeller, Beer Geek Breakfast Stout, Harpoon IPA, Funkwork Raspberry Provincial, Star Brewery Jomo, Bell's Two Hearted, Oscar's Chocolate Oatmeal Stout, and Racer 5 so far. And I've had some hits and misses, honestly, but that got me. It's a really great base for tweaking beers. If there's a style you like, there's a beer in here for you. So if you're sort of like me and you're just looking for some guidance on recipes, it's fantastic. Also, it does include notes from the breweries as well, so they'll throw in try this or not that, or this is why we did this thing. They also have both all grain and extract, when like possible, versions of those beers. So it's just a great compendium of recipes to go to. So if you're worked out great for me.
Yeah, I've borrowed a couple of those recipes out of there, and that's a great book. All right, number 2 for me is Lager by Dave Carpenter, the definitive guide to tasting and brewing the world's most popular beer styles. So this is kind of another one of those books that, the first half of the book is really about the history of lager, where it came from, how it grew into what it is today. So, starting in Germany and Central Europe, and then growing into, Central America and in Mexico, and here into the United States in the 1800s, then what happened during Prohibition, and then moving on into the modern day lagers, both macro and at the craft beer level. But it also gives you things like, glassware for lager beer. You go into Europe and every single brewery has a different, glass for every single beer they have. So all that kind of stuff, sensory evaluations, all the different, it goes through each of the different old world pale lagers and what they are, and dark lagers, and then North American lagers. Then it talks you through wort production, mashing, boiling, and then I think most importantly, fermentation and packaging. Those are very important, especially when you're trying to nail those crisp lager styles. And then it's got a group of recipes, not nearly as many as the other book I mentioned, but a couple in here. And I have brewed one. I brewed the Munich Dunkel. You guys have had it. I'm still working on tweaking the recipe a little bit. I'm not liking exactly where it is, but it's not a bad beer. It's a delicious beer. It's just not where I want it to be. So that's Lager by Dave Carpenter.
So Phil, if I may ask, so are these generic recipes, or are these like clones of different lager beers?
A couple of them are clones. So there's like a Smutty Nose Baltic Porter in here. There's a Trogs beer in here. And then some of these are inspired. So there's like a Weyermann Bohemian Pilsner, which is an original recipe from 1842, a blend.
Does it have the greatest lager ever made in there, Natty Ice?
Jesus. Wait, isn't that PBR? Isn't that supposed to be PBR?
No, you're wrong. It's actually Natty Ice.
PBR.
I'm just looking for a recipe for Natty Ice. Just tell me if Natty Ice is in there, Phil.
No, it is not. All you need is just go to your urinal and take out what you put in.
That's all right. So that we should do a round table on our shit beers that we absolutely love.
Yeah,
because that'll be a good one someday.
Yeah. All right, Marco, you got number 2.
Yeah, so number 2 for me, I'm continuing on my path of Belgian beers, and the book is called Farmhouse Ales: Culture and Craftsmanship in the Belgian Tradition by Phil Markowski. It's part of a series which the last book that I mentioned is a part of. And what this book really focuses on is 2 specific farmhouse styles of beer, Saisons and Bière de Garde. It does touch on some derivatives, grisettes and like Bière de Mars or Bière de Noël. It does touch on some of those. But it primarily focuses on Belgian breweries. But what I love about this book is it dives pretty deep into Belgian beer history. It goes into talking about some of the old Belgian breweries, what their processes were, how they did things, where they started, why they're brewing the beers that they brew, where these beers came from. So it's just really interesting. I've mentioned on the podcast that my favorite type of beer is a Saison. That is my number one. So learning a lot about the history of these farmhouse ales, I thought was really cool. And Belgium's been making beer they're one of the oldest countries on the planet making beer. So they've really honed in on this craft and this style of beer. So it does do a good job of talking a little bit about process. It also does, shares you some clone recipes with some of the breweries like Brewery Fantôme or DuPont. It shares some clone recipes of their beers, has some new age styles that you can create. But what's also cool about it is that they are just going to give you a ton of info. It does get kind of technical at times in the book. They go into like water chemistry and profiles, which is great if you're really trying to perfect a Saison or farmhouse ale. But what they're really doing is just trying to make sure if you're going to try to tackle it, you're going to understand your yeast strains so that you're using proper fermentation tactics with them, and that you're just going to brew better Saisons, and you understanding like what hops to pick and why those hops are being chosen, what type of Pilsner malts to use, why they're being chosen, so that you can just brew a better Saison or bière de garde.
Fun fact, Phil Markowski is the head brewer of Two Rose Brewery in Connecticut. Which is sort of ironic because I don't think they do Saisons.
They do one. I think they do one, and it's not that great. But the amount of information that he shares in this book, you'd think that he spent, I don't know that much about him, but you'd think that he spent a ton of time in Belgium studying these beers.
Yeah, that is a great book. I have it, and a couple of those recipes are in my Beersmith ready to go. I haven't brewed any yet, but all right. So now we are on to our number one picks. Up first is Nick. Number one pick.
Yes, this is my favorite beer book by far. It's the one I reference the most. It is called Brewing Classic Styles by Jamil Zaini, I'm not sure, and John Palmer. A couple of these other guys are going to talk about books about designing beers, but I'm going to throw down the gauntlet. This is the best one. There's our shit. Buy this one. It is the best. The only, I guess, caveat is this book was written before the 2015 BJCP guidelines. So the beers that they focus on are on the 2008 guidelines. So there's some crossover, but there's still some that are missing. So basically, it's a beer design book. So basically, Jamil Zaini, just a little bit of background. He's a pretty world-renowned home brewer. He's won Brewer of the Year, NHC multiple times. God knows how many medals. He now has his own brewery in California, but he used to be known as sort of the homebrew guru or one of them. I think he had a podcast on Brewing Network for a long time. Maybe he still does. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This book is just him going through every single BJCP style, talking about what the BJCP guidelines say. He talks about how to make the best example of that style and what to sort of focus on, and then he gives a example of a recipe. What's great is his recipes are very simple. So he rarely will have one that has more than 4 or 5 malts. They're simple, they're to the point. Many of the amounts are sort of rounded up or rounded down to make it easy on someone. They have extract and all grain. He talks about the hops, the yeast, fermentation, and conditioning. And sometimes he'll talk a little bit of story about how he designed the recipe or where he got the name from, which is really interesting. So, as I mentioned, it's pretty much every style that you can think of. There's an example of a recipe and sort of his thoughts on that. And again, there's some that are missing. Obviously, the 2015 BJCP guidelines have other examples of styles like Amber Czech beer. That's not in this book, but for the most part, it's pretty good crossover. I have used this book countless amount of times when I want to brew a new different style of beer that I have no idea what the recipe would be like. So I have this whole thing bookmarked about different styles I've gone back to, just get an idea about what it should look like generally, and then maybe I'll kind of modify it a little bit or expand on it. Regardless, this is the best beer design book if you're interested in homebrewing, different styles, and understanding the styles and what goes into the styles. Get this book. I highly, highly recommend it.
Number one pick, Tim.
I take your beer author guys and raise you another beer author guy, Gordon Strong. All right, Gordon Strong. Now, hang on. So, Gordon Strong, the book is called Modern Homebrew Recipes, right? But Gordon Strong, 3-time winner of the AHA Ninkasi Award. So, highest award you can get, and he's the only 3-time winner of the AHA and Ninkasi Awards. And also, president of the frickin' BJCP. So you can't get any better than that. And so this takes kind of what I was doing with the Big Book of Clones book that I talked about earlier, and gets a little more serious about style, technique, and process, and things like that. So I have to say, just right out of the chute, some of the best beers that I've brewed so far, and some of the beers that have been best received by our homebrew club so far, like a Czech dark lager, Mexican Vienna, things like that have come out of this book. So not only am I getting some interesting sort of remakes of classical recipes, but he gives you a lot of information on, why he's doing what he's doing, what the tweaks are. I love in each of the recipes, he gives you a sensory description, which is basically his beer judging notes on a beer. So you can, it's one thing if you have the Big Book of Clone recipes, you have the beer next to you, maybe the commercial beer, and you can try it next to what you've brewed and get some sense of it. But here he's helping, which is what I need work on, is developing my sense of beer and how to judge beer and taste beer and things like that. So really good sensory description notes. Formulation notes is another piece that he throws in there too, which is specific processes that he calls out, or other techniques and things like that are special, different, interesting for each of the beers. Variations on each of the recipes, like how to tweak them. This book is all about sort of modernizing some of the standard beers that are out there, recipes that you'd have, and so that's what I've really liked about it. He also goes into, at the beginning of the book, there's a lot on just process and technique and recipe formulation as well, which I'm sure surpasses what just Nick had to talk about. But so that's why I picked Modern Homebrew Recipes, one of my favorites. So,
all kidding aside, that is a great book. I own it.
It is a great book.
It's a really great book. It definitely focuses more on, not as much on sort of BJCP styles, but more about just styles of beer in general. But I think that book goes a little bit more into detail, and those recipes are a little bit more complex, I think, which is good, can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. But regardless, I've brewed some really good beers from that book, and it's excellent.
Yeah, there's been, some of the beers have been, I think maybe the Czech dark lager that had multiple mash steps and decoctions, and not that one necessarily, but he's into some of the old school stuff, but mixing it in with sort of modernizing and thinking, how do we make this better or interesting and things like that. So, yeah, super cool.
I see your two books really as companion pieces, and that's kind of how they live on my bookshelf and how I've brewed out of them.
Yep.
All right, my number one pick is the new IPA, A Scientific Guide to Hop Aroma and Flavor by Scott Janish. Scott is the co-founder of Sapwood Cellars with Michael Tonsmere, who's written the American Sours book. And this book is all about IPAs and hops and the modern usages of it. This book was published in 2019, so this is relatively recent in the world of hazy IPAs and New England IPAs. He goes deep into hop compounds, the pros and cons of hot side hopping. Oxidation is huge in this book. I think just about every single chapter has a mention on oxidation at the various points of the brewing process and the impact on hops and the IPAs. There's some pretty technical detail in here, so if you are all into thiols and beta glucose and terpenoids and whatever else. I'm sorry, I'm butchering these. Nick is shaking his head at me. If you are into all that kind of stuff, you're going to love the book. If you're not, you're still going to learn a ton. Then he goes into haze production and why haze exists in hazy IPAs versus in a West Coast IPA beyond just filtering, and then stability between oxidation and timing of your hopping in both the hot and cold side, and your packaging, how important that can be. And then he's got some tips from some big breweries such as the Bissell Brothers and Other Half, Great Notion. But the key I like about this book is, I've read it probably 4 or 5 times now. Every chapter has a key findings at the very end of the chapter. There's probably 2 or 3 pages of key bullet points from that, probably 20 to 30 page chapter. So if you are, you've read the book a couple times and you need to refer back, you can just skip back to the key findings pages, find those things that you were looking for, and then dive back into the chapter as you need to. So if you are into building your IPAs and making them better and learning why hops are doing what they're doing in your beer and how to make it all awesome, this is the book you need. And I know both home brewers and professional brewers that are using this book as a resource.
Have you read the Hops book by Stan Hieronymus? Would you recommend one over the other, or do you recall the differences between the two?
I haven't read that hop book, other than I know Stan wrote the foreword for this book.
Okay, that's probably a good sign.
Number 1 pick for Marco.
Yeah, first, Phil, I really appreciate you breaking up the cock measuring contest that was happening between Tim and Nick there, because I just wasn't going to be able to compete with either one of them, as I normally can't. So a little context before I say which book I picked. When I first started brewing, I was a extract brewer, then partial mash, and then into all grain. And I started brewing recipe kits that I got from the local homebrew shops, to then doing clone recipes, to then being really interested in designing my own recipes. And I use Beersmith primarily for that. And I have been since I downloaded Beersmith. I haven't used any other platform for that. So when I really started to dive into building my own recipes, it's not as simple as people think it is, right? Like if you just brew recipes off of kits, or you're doing clones, you can't just create your own recipe. It's really not that simple. So the book that I would suggest as the number 1 is called Designing Great Beers, and it's by Ray Daniels. And it basically doesn't go into the depth of styles like brewing classic styles like Nick mentioned. But what it does do is really help you kind of wrap your head around building a recipe. So it goes through the larger categories of styles like pale ales and bitters and pale lagers, or cold IPAs as we know them today. I couldn't help but laugh at that one. But he just goes into what these beers are about, and then when you're formulating a recipe for them, how to really understand the data that you're trying to create with making that recipe. It goes into, and not ad nauseum, actually. This book is a really easy read. The book is designed technically for more intermediate or advanced homebrewers, but the read is really simple. Like you can get through it. It's a relatively long book, but you can get through it pretty quickly. But what it is going to help you do is understand all the nuances of what ingredients do to beers, and then help you kind of match up your process so that it fits your recipe. Because some of the things that folks have encountered, and we've actually, Phil, you and I have talked a little bit about this recently, is when you're brewing a beer. I think we actually did this during the bitter off. We talked about this during the bitter off. When you're creating a beer recipe and you're calculating your IBUs, for example, he's really basically pairing up what that process is so that you can be really much more accurate. So obviously capturing the data correctly is something that it really talks about, making sure that you have the correct information that you're entering into whatever program you're using, but how to really build that recipe with other ingredients to hit those characteristics that you're trying to hit. So it's a really cool book. It does say it's for intermediate or advanced homebrewers, but I do think even beginner homebrewers will get a ton from it. So I think it's worth the read. And if you're ready to make that step into looking at these classic styles and trying to build recipes that are going to produce good beers for you, this is a book that I would suggest you use for that.
Awesome. So that was our top threes from each of us. Kind of wrote down a couple honorable mentions that I didn't hear. So the first one's the American Sour by Michael Tonsmere, or is it Modern American Sour or something like that?
It's American Sour Beers.
American Sour Beers is what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a fantastic book. He's the partner to Scott at Sapwood Cellars, and I've been to a couple of his seminars at HomebrewCon. Fantastic seminars. And then the other one nobody picked out, maybe because it's not a book, is Zymurgy. So if you join the American Homebrewers Association, you get the companion magazine Zymurgy. It's not every month, it's a couple, like every other month, something like that. That is a fantastic magazine. You not only get the magazine itself, but you get access through the web to every past issue of the magazine.
It's a good one.
I love it. I think there's some really cool stuff that they it's just really up-to-date trends that are happening in home brewing, new info, new equipment. It shares a lot of stuff that homebrewers are doing. It is an awesome resource for sure.
I like that they skipped over the CBD beers and went right to the pot beers and how do you brew a good pot beer. So
Totally honest, Tim. I didn't even know CBD beers were a thing, and probably for good reason.
They shouldn't be.
The other thing you get with your AHA membership is access to a ton of recipes. So all of these books that we've talked about on homebrew recipes and designing your own recipes, the AHA website has a ton of recipes. If you win a medal in the National Homebrew Competition, you have to give a copy of your recipe, and they get published. So that is a fantastic.
I think only first place gets published, right?
There's a ton
for
of
second, third, I think.
Yeah,
No,
first,
I think
second, third.
for second, third.
No,
Yeah,
I think it's no, because I'm not tooting my own horn.
I'm just saying bronze is. I see.
I'm just saying I'm not tooting it, but I've come in second place in an HC, and my recipe was not, maybe for good reason, but it was not posted.
Well, if I came in second.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the point.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah, well, whatever.
They may have changed it recently, but
yeah.
They named the people that win second, third. They only post the recipe the first. There's no way they do all. Otherwise, it would be like the size of a textbook. You have like what, 30 categories? I mean,
I have a feeling I've seen bronze and silvers there before, but yeah, they probably changed it.
maybe there's a standout. Yeah, maybe it's not all of them. Maybe there's some that just stand out.
Right. Yeah, that could be. Yeah.
So anyway, hope you enjoyed this segment about our favorite homebrewing books. We probably could bring on a couple different folks in the club and get a completely different list, but this is ours. So thank you guys for joining us, and I hope to talk to y'all soon. Next week on Strike Mash Boil, we will have the first of a new series of segments called Hop It To Me, all about hops and IPA. And we will have a good friend of ours and former club member, and now the founder of Channel Marker Brewing, Justin Negrati, join the show to talk about how he made the jump from home brewer to owner of one of the hottest new breweries here in Massachusetts. That and more, so stay tuned next week here at Strike Mash Boil. The Strike Mash Boil podcast is produced by the Merrimack Valley Homebrew Club, an AHA-sanctioned club. Follow us on Instagram at Strike Mash Boil. Join the conversation in our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/MVHBC, or send us some feedback at strikemashboil@mvhbc.com. Welcome back to Strike Mash Boil. I don't know how to. I can't speak today. Fuck. For you guys who listen to the show every week, you know that I like to throw in a blooper at the end of the show, and you just heard me fuck up the intro, which happened like a dozen times. But the next one is really what I have to do in editing. So what you're going to hear is the raw audio of Tim talking about a book
but in the background, you are going to hear Marco's mic live as he's rustling through a book trying to figure out what the hell he's going to say next. And this is the shit I'm constantly editing out. Forget the ums and uhs and you knows and likes. It's this shit that really drives me crazy.
Variations on each of the recipes, like, how to tweak them. This book is all about sort of modernizing some of the standard beers that are out there, recipes that you'd have, and so that's what I really liked about it. He also goes into, at the beginning of the book, there's a lot on just process and technique and recipe formulation as well, which I'm sure surpasses what just Nick had to talk about. But yeah, so that's why I picked Modern Homebrew Recipes, one of my favorites. So.